Chapter 1. The Lure of the Macabre. Ethan Hayes, a freelance journalist whose career had stalled in the stagnant waters of local news, felt the desert wind whip past his open car window, carrying with it the scent of dust and a faint, unsettling sweetness that he couldn't quite place. He was driving towards Tonopah, Nevada, a speck on the map known less for its silver mines and more for a bizarre, unsettling landmark, the Clown Motel. His editor, a man whose cynicism was only matched by his desperation for clicks, had scoffed at the idea. A Clown Motel, Hayes? Really? What's next? A haunted laundromat. But Ethan, fueled by a potent cocktail of professional ambition and annoying self-doubt, saw it differently. This wasn't just a quirky roadside attraction. It was a potential gold mine, a human interest piece with a macabre twist, a story that could finally pull him from the journalistic purgatory he'd been languishing in since his last major screw-up. A botched expose that had cost him a significant chunk of his reputation and, more painfully, his self-respect. The motel, with its local legends of a tormented clown spirit, was, to his mind, merely folklore, a convenient hook for a piece that would, he hoped, redefine his career. His research had been thorough, almost obsessive. He delved into dusty online forums, scanned digitized newspaper archives, and even tracked down a few reluctant locals willing to whisper about the motel's eccentric founder. The story of the ringmaster, a man named Silas Blackwood, was as unsettling as the motel itself. Blackwood, a former circus impresario with a peculiar fascination for the grotesque, had built the motel in the 1980s as a monument to his favorite performer, a clown named Giggles. The tales surrounding Giggles were shrouded in tragedy and mystery, a life of hidden sorrow behind a painted smile, culminating in a mysterious death within the motel's very walls. The locals claimed Giggles' spirit lingered, a silent, grinning sentinel. Ethan, however, remained a skeptic, his journalistic detachment a carefully constructed shield against the anxieties that constantly nipped at his heels. He saw the motel as a stage, the legends as mere props, and himself as the objective observer, ready to dissect the bizarre and present it to a hungry audience. As he approached Tonopah, a vast, empty Nevada landscape stretched out before him, an endless expanse of scrub brush and distant, jagged mountains. The isolation was profound, mirroring the internal landscape of Ethan's own professional desperation. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch with a life of their own. It was a beautiful, yet desolate, vista, a fitting backdrop for the unsettling destination that awaited him. The town itself was a collection of faded buildings, a testament to a bygone era, and then, stark against the twilight, he saw it. The Clown Motel. It was a garish explosion of primary colors, a grotesque carnival tent transplanted onto the desert floor. Hundreds of clown dolls and mannequins, their painted smiles frozen in unsettling grins, adorned every available surface. Perched on the roof, peering from windows, even lining the narrow driveway. Their eyes, some glassy, some painted, seemed to follow his car as he pulled into the gravel lot. The air, already thick with the desert's dry heat, now carried a faint, cloying scent, like stale popcorn mixed with something metallic and vaguely sweet, a smell that immediately assaulted his senses and created an atmosphere of unease that began to chip away at his rational facade. He parked his car and stepped out, the silence of the desert broken only by the creak of the motel's weathered sign and the faint rustle of the wind through the dry brush. As he approached the reception desk, a small, dimly lit cubicle crammed with even more clown paraphernalia, he noticed a figure huddled near the exit. It was an elderly woman, her hair disheveled, her clothes rumpled, her eyes wide with a frantic, unseeing terror. She was muttering to herself, a low, guttural sound, something about the smiles that watch, always watching. Before Ethan could even process her words, she bolted, her frail frame surprisingly agile, as she fled into the deepening twilight, disappearing into the vast, indifferent desert night. The encounter, so sudden and unsettling, sent a shiver down Ethan's spine, a tiny crack in his carefully constructed wall of skepticism. He checked in with a weary, almost robotic clerk, whose own face seemed to wear a permanent, unsettlingly wide smile, though whether it was natural or painted, Ethan couldn't tell in the dim light. He was handed a heavy, antique-looking key, the number 13 etched into its tarnished brass. His room, the clerk informed him with a slight, almost imperceptible twitch of his smile, was at the very end of the corridor. As Ethan walked down the long, narrow hallway, the clown portraits on the walls seemed to watch him, their painted eyes following his every step. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint, sweet metallic scent intensified. He unlocked the door to room 13, and the sight that greeted him was a meticulously themed chamber, a shrine to the grotesque. Every surface was adorned with clown dolls, porcelain, plastic, fabric, their painted smiles and vacant stares filling every corner. A particularly large, antique clown doll sat on the dresser, its painted smile wider than the rest, its glassy eyes fixed directly on the door. As Ethan attempted to set up his recording equipment, his journalistic detachment already wavering in the face of the motel's oppressive ambience, he noticed it. A single dark, viscous tear, thick and glistening, slowly traced a path down the painted cheek of the largest clown doll on the dresser. It moved with an unnatural slowness, catching the dim light from the single overhead bulb. He blinked, convinced his eyes were playing tricks on him, a trick of the light, a figment of his tired imagination. But when he looked again, the tear was gone, leaving no trace, no streak, no dampness on the doll's pristine, painted face. He reached out, his finger hovering inches from the doll, a strange compulsion to touch the spot where the tear had been. As his finger brushed against the cold, smooth porcelain, he felt a sharp, burning sensation, as if he had touched a live wire. He recoiled, his hand throbbing, and instinctively glanced at his reflection in the small, dusty mirror on the opposite wall. For a fleeting, horrifying second, a faint, almost imperceptible, clown-like grin appeared on his own reflection, superimposed over his own lips, only to vanish as quickly as it came. It was a subtle, personal manifestation, a chilling whisper of the motel's insidious connection to him, a suggestion that he was already being marked. The chapter ends with Ethan alone in his room, the painted smiles of the clown dolls seeming to watch him, their silent judgment a palpable weight in the air. The shift in the ambience was no longer subtle. It was a palpable presence, a cold, grinning dread that promised psychological torment to come, now with a tangible, disturbing visual that had branded itself onto his very being. Chapter 2. The first cracks in the facade, the lingering sensation of the burning touch on his finger, and the fleeting, grotesque grin in the mirror gnawed at Ethan. He tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it away as a trick of the light, a symptom of exhaustion, or perhaps even a psychological response to the motel's overwhelming, unsettling decor. He was a journalist, a man of facts and logic, not a believer in spectral tears or phantom grins. Yet the unease had taken root, a cold, insidious tendril curling around his carefully constructed skepticism. He spent the remainder of the night in a fitful, restless sleep, the painted smiles of the clown dolls seeming to watch him from every corner of the room, their silent judgment a palpable weight in the oppressive silence. Morning brought a deceptive sense of normalcy. The harsh desert light streaming through the window seemed to banish the shadows, making the clown dolls appear less menacing, more like kitschy, albeit unsettling decorations. Ethan, determined to regain his journalistic objectivity, decided to begin his investigation by interviewing the motel's manager. He found the man behind the same cluttered reception desk, his unsettlingly wide smile still in place. The manager, a gaunt figure with eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken stories, was initially evasive, offering vague and unsettling anecdotes about past guests. He spoke of a woman who had checked in for a single night and was found the next morning, sitting upright in her bed, her eyes wide open and unblinking, a serene, almost blissful smile on her face, as if she had witnessed something beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. She just smiled, the manager had said, his own smile twitching almost imperceptibly. Never blinked, never moved, just smiled. He also recounted tales of strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, disembodied laughter, and the inexplicable feeling of being watched. Ethan, ever the skeptic, attributed these to the manager's own eccentricities, or perhaps a clever marketing ploy to enhance the motel's macabre reputation. As night began to fall once more, painting the desert sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges, Ethan set up his equipment. He planned to conduct a live stream to capture the motel's eerie ambience and his own initial impressions for his online audience. But from the moment he hit record, he was plagued by technical difficulties. His camera flickered, the audio crackled with static, and his internet connection wavered, dropping in and out with frustrating regularity. He tried to troubleshoot, but it was as if an unseen force was actively sabotaging his efforts. Then the distortions began. Fleeting, distorted images of clown faces, their grins impossibly wide, would flash across his screen, superimposed over his own reflection. His voice, when it did come through, was often garbled, echoing with an unnatural reverb. He dismissed it as a faulty connection, a glitch in the matrix, but a cold knot of dread began to tighten in his stomach. He started to notice subtle, unsettling details that defied rational explanation. A clown doll, perched precariously on a shelf, seemed to have shifted its position, its painted eyes now fixed directly on him, a silent, unblinking gaze that sent a shiver down his spine. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of stale popcorn and grease paint, cloying and sweet, hung in the air, a phantom aroma that seemed to cling to him. And the silence of the motel, a heavy, oppressive blanket, was punctuated by what sounded like distant, muffled laughter, a sound that seemed to emanate not from outside, but from inside his own head, a chilling echo of the manager's unsettling smile. Ethan tried to rationalize these occurrences, attributing them to fatigue, the motel's unsettling decor, or his own overactive imagination. He reviewed his footage, searching for logical explanations, but found only more ambiguity, more unsettling anomalies that chipped away at his carefully constructed facade of journalistic objectivity. The psychological toll began to manifest as he experienced vivid, unsettling dreams. Distorted clown faces, their grins stretching into grotesque caricatures, danced in his subconscious, their echoing laughter reverberating through his mind even after he woke. He would wake abruptly, convinced he had heard something, a whisper, a movement, a presence, but would find nothing amiss in the dim light of his room. The clown dolls remained motionless, their painted smiles unwavering, yet he felt their eyes on him, a silent, malevolent judgment. One such abrupt awakening left him disoriented, his heart pounding. He swung his legs out of bed, and as his bare foot touched the floor, he stepped on something wet and sticky. A jolt of revulsion shot through him. He fumbled for the lamp, his fingers trembling, and flicked it on. There, on the worn carpet, lay a small, intricately carved wooden clown nose, covered in what appeared to be fresh, dark blood. It was a macabre, impossible artifact, a tangible piece of the nightmare that was slowly consuming him. The chapter concludes with Ethan's growing unease, his journalistic objectivity slowly eroding as the motel's insidious influence begins to take hold, blurring the lines between reality and his burgeoning paranoia. He felt a chilling sensation, as if he was being watched, and caught a fleeting glimpse of a distorted reflection in the mirror. A hint of the ghostly grin, now accompanied by a faint, guttural chuckle that seemed to come from behind him, a sound that made the hairs on his neck stand on end, confirming that he was no longer just observing the horror, but was becoming a part of it. Chapter 3. The echoes of a twisted past. The bloodied wooden clown nose lay on the bedside table, a grotesque, undeniable artifact of the previous night's terror. Ethan stared at it, his mind reeling, trying to reconcile the tangible horror with his journalistic skepticism. The guttural chuckle he'd heard, the distorted reflection in the mirror, these were not tricks of the light or products of a tired mind. The motel was actively, malevolently engaging with him. His carefully constructed facade of journalistic composure, already fractured, now crumbled entirely. He was no longer an objective observer. He was a participant, a target, Driven by a desperate need for answers, or perhaps a subconscious desire to prove his sanity, Ethan delved deeper into the motel's history. He spent hours hunched over his laptop, the screen a flickering beacon in the oppressive gloom of his room, sifting through digitized newspaper clippings and obscure online forums. The stories he unearthed were chillingly consistent. Disappearances, unexplained deaths, and accounts of guests driven to madness, all linked to the Clown Motel. Each incident had been dismissed by authorities as urban legends, unfortunate accidents, or the ramblings of unstable minds. But now, with the wooden nose a stark reality beside him, Ethan saw a pattern, a sinister thread weaving through decades of alleged folklore. He learned more about Silas Blackwood, the motel's founder, a man whose obsession with clowns bordered on the pathological. Blackwood, it seemed, was not merely an eccentric ringmaster. He was a sadist, a puppeteer who delighted in the psychological torment of his performers. The forums whispered of his cruel experiments, his methods of breaking down the human spirit, all under the guise of artistic expression. And then there was Giggles, the tragic clown whose spirit was said to linger. Ethan discovered that Giggles' sorrow wasn't just a performance. It was a carefully cultivated despair, nurtured by Blackwood's relentless psychological abuse. The more Ethan read, the more he realized that the motel wasn't just a place where a clown had died. It was a monument to a madman's cruelty, a stage where the performance of torment continued long after the curtain had fallen on Blackwood's own life. The psychological manipulation intensified with each passing hour. The whispers that had once been faint now seemed to call his name, slithering into his ears like venomous snakes, twisting his thoughts. Distorted circus music, a discordant symphony of calliopes and off-key trumpets, played just at the edge of his hearing, a constant, maddening hum. And the distinct sound of a child's laughter, innocent yet utterly terrifying, would echo through the room, only to vanish as quickly as it came, leaving Ethan's heart pounding in his chest. He started to question his own sanity, doubting his perceptions, struggling to differentiate between reality and the insidious illusions the motel was weaving around him. Was he truly hearing these things, or was his mind finally breaking under the strain? The clown dolls in his room, once merely unsettling decorations, now seemed to possess a malevolent sentience. Their painted smiles, already wide, grew impossibly wider when he wasn't directly looking at them, their glassy eyes seeming to bore into his very soul. He tried to move them, to cover them with sheets, even to remove them from the room, but they always seemed to reappear or exert an unseen pressure, as if rooted to their spots by an invisible force. He would turn his back for a second, and a doll that had been facing the wall would now be facing him, its painted grin a silent, mocking challenge. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an oppressive presence that seemed to press down on him, stealing his breath. Then came the mirror incident. Ethan, desperate for a moment of clarity, splashed cold water on his face, looking up into his reflection. For a split second, his own face distorted, his lips stretching into a grotesque, clown-like grin, his eyes widening with a chilling, unblinking intensity. It was a horrifying premonition, a glimpse into the motel's true power, its ability to corrupt and transform. He recoiled, his heart hammering against his ribs, the image seared into his mind. He began to suspect that the haunting was not merely a passive presence, a lingering echo of a past tragedy, but an active, intelligent entity that was specifically targeting his vulnerabilities and fears, feeding on his growing terror. Overwhelmed, Ethan lunged for the door, a primal urge to escape overriding all journalistic curiosity. He twisted the knob, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled, he pushed, he hammered on the wood, but the door remained stubbornly shut, as if sealed by an invisible force. As he struggled, the room plunged into darkness, a single overhead bulb flickering and dying. In the sudden, suffocating blackness, he heard it, the faint, almost imperceptible creak of wood, followed by the soft, rhythmic scuffing sound of something being dragged across the floor. Then, a chorus of faint metallic clicks, like gears turning, and the distinct sound of tiny, porcelain limbs shifting. The clown dolls. They were moving. He could feel the air grow colder, the faint scent of blood and decay, now mingled with the cloying sweetness of grease paint, filling the room. He heard the soft thud of a doll hitting the floor, and another, closer this time. The silence was broken only by his own ragged breathing, and the unsettling sounds of the dolls converging on him, their painted eyes, though unseen, glowing with an internal, malevolent light. The chapter ends with Ethan feeling increasingly isolated and trapped within the motel, the psychological torment escalating, and the chilling realization that he might be in over his head, far beyond a simple ghost story. As the clown dolls closed in, their grins widening impossibly in the suffocating darkness, their unseen presence, a suffocating weight upon his soul. Chapter 4. The Veil Thins. A personal hell. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that pressed in on Ethan, amplifying the chilling sounds of the clown doll's advance. He scrambled backward, his hands flailing, desperate to find a light switch, a door, anything to break the terrifying intimacy of the black. The metallic clicks and soft thuds grew louder, closer, punctuated by what sounded like faint, distorted giggles. He could feel the cold air swirling around him, carrying the cloying scent of grease paint and decay, now tinged with something metallic and sharp, the smell of blood. Just as he felt a cold porcelain hand brush against his ankle, the single overhead bulb flickered back to life, bathing the room in a sickly yellow glow. The clown dolls were indeed closer, some now perched on the edge of the bed, others clustered near the door, their painted smiles impossibly wide, their glassy eyes fixed on him. He lunged for the door again, twisting the knob with desperate force, but it remained stubbornly locked. The room, once a mere motel chamber, now felt like a cage, a meticulously designed trap. The paranormal activity, which had been insidious and psychological, now escalated dramatically, moving beyond subtle torment to overt, terrifying manifestations. Ethan's personal fears and anxieties, the very ones that had driven him to this desolate motel, were now weaponized against him with ruthless precision. The ghostly grin, once a fleeting reflection, was now omnipresent. It shimmered on the walls, a phosphorescent smear that seemed to pulse with malevolence. It appeared on the faces of the clown dolls, their painted smiles twisting into grotesque, animated sneers. And then, terrifyingly, it began to appear on the faces of strangers he encountered outside the motel. A fleeting distortion on the face of a gas station attendant. A momentary twist of a passerby's lips into that familiar, horrifying rictus. He would blink, and it would be gone, leaving him questioning his own sanity. The line between reality and hallucination blurring into an indistinguishable nightmare. Objects in his room began to move on their own. His recording equipment, once meticulously arranged, would be scattered across the floor. The heavy antique key to his room would slide across the dresser, stopping just short of the edge. Doors would slam shut with a resounding thud, even when there was no breeze. The temperature in his room fluctuated wildly, from an oppressive, humid heat that made his skin crawl to an icy chill that seemed to seep into his bones. The auditory hallucinations, once whispers, now became a deafening cacophony. Distorted laughter, screams that sounded eerily like his own, and the incessant, off-key circus music pounded in his ears. A relentless assault that threatened to shatter his sanity. He tried to block it out, pressing his hands against his ears, but the sounds seemed to emanate from within his own mind, a torment he couldn't escape. His nights were a descent into waking nightmares. The clown dolls, once inanimate, now came to life in his tormented visions. Their painted smiles twisted into malevolent sneers. Their eyes, once glassy, now glowed with an internal, predatory light. They would move slowly at first, and with an unnerving speed, their tiny, porcelain hands reaching for him, their silent, grinning faces inches from his own. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering, the images seared into his mind, the lingering scent of stale popcorn and blood, a phantom presence in the air. He tried to leave the motel, to escape the escalating horror, but found himself inexplicably drawn back. His car, which had been perfectly fine, suddenly had a flat tire, the spare inexplicably missing. A sudden, disorienting fog would roll in, thick and impenetrable, obscuring the road and forcing him to turn back. Or an overwhelming dread would paralyze him, a crushing weight that pinned him to the spot, making any attempt at escape futile. During one particularly intense manifestation, triggered by his desperate attempt to flee, Ethan stumbled upon a hidden room. He had been frantically searching for a way out, pounding on walls, when a section of the wallpaper in the motel's dilapidated lobby seemed to give way under his hand. Behind it, a narrow, dust-choked passage led to a small, forgotten chamber. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and decay. In the center of the room, on a rickety wooden table, lay a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. He picked it up, his hands trembling, and began to read. The journal belonged to Silas Blackwood, the ringmaster, and its contents were a chilling revelation. It detailed his true, sadistic nature, his meticulous experiments in psychological manipulation on his performers, and his chilling belief that he could trap and control human emotions, particularly fear and despair. He wrote of giggles, not as a victim, but as his greatest success, a performer whose sorrow he had cultivated and amplified, turning it into a macabre art form. The journal detailed his obsession with making Giggle's despair eternal, a perpetual performance for his own twisted amusement. He wrote of the motel itself, not as a tribute, but as a machine, a grand stage designed to continue his psychological torture even after his death, feeding on the deepest fears of its guests. This revelation shifted the narrative from a simple ghost story to something far more sinister and psychologically complex. The motel was not just haunted by a clown. It was a living, breathing instrument of a madman's will, designed to torture its inhabitants by feeding on their deepest fears. And then, a terrifying scene unfolded before him. As he read the chilling words, the air in the hidden room grew heavy, and a distorted reflection shimmered in the dusty glass of a framed photograph on the wall. It was the elderly guest from Chapter 1, her face contorted in a silent scream, her eyes wide with the same unblinking terror the manager had described. She was trapped within the reflection, her hands pressed against the glass as if trying to escape. Her reflection then shattered, not with the sound of breaking glass, but with a horrifying, wet crack, and a single blood-red tear rolled down the mirror, leaving a viscous trail. The chapter ends with Ethan realizing the true nature of the threat. It was not a simple spirit, but a malevolent intelligence that had been meticulously crafting his personal hell, and that his own past failures and insecurities were the very fuel for its power. The chilling knowledge that others had succumbed to its torment, and that he was now part of a long line of victims, settled over him like a shroud, promising a performance from which there might be no escape. Chapter 5. The Architect of Fear. The ringmaster's journal lay open on the dusty table, its brittle pages filled with the chilling confessions of a madman. The horrifying vision of the trapped elderly guest, her silent scream echoing in the shattered reflection, had seared itself into Ethan's mind. The knowledge gleaned from Blackwood's twisted manifesto was a heavy, suffocating weight, yet it ignited something within him, a desperate resolve that burned through the fog of his fear. He was no longer just a victim, a pawn in a ghostly game. He was a journalist with the most terrifying story of his life, and he was going to expose it, to dismantle this psychological torture chamber, or die trying. Armed with this horrifying new understanding, Ethan began to actively search for a way to fight back. The motel was not merely haunted. It was a machine, a meticulously designed instrument of torment, and every machine had a weakness, a control panel, a source of power. His investigation was no longer about documenting the paranormal. It was about finding the off switch. He moved through the motel's dilapidated corridors, his senses on high alert, searching for hidden mechanisms, secret passages, or the control room where the ringmaster had orchestrated his macabre experiments. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights was now a potential clue, a piece of the puzzle. But his search was not unguarded. The motel, as if sensing his shift in purpose, unleashed its full arsenal of psychological warfare. The ghostly grin was now omnipresent, a constant, mocking presence. It shimmered on the peeling wallpaper, It swirled in the dust motes, dancing in the dim light. It even appeared in the condensation on the windows, a fleeting spectral sneer. The clown dolls, no longer content with subtle movements, now seemed to possess a sinister sentience. They would appear in unexpected places, blocking his path, their painted eyes following his every move. He would open a closet door and find a dozen of them crammed inside, their grins a silent, menacing chorus. He would turn a corner and find one perched on a light fixture, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, as if observing him with a malevolent intelligence. The manifestations became deeply personal, targeting his deepest insecurities with surgical precision. He would hear the voice of his former editor, mocking his failures, his voice echoing from empty rooms. He would see apparitions of his parents, their faces etched with disappointment, their ghostly forms dissolving into dust when he reached for them. The motel was a master of psychological torture, and it was using his own past against him, turning his regrets into weapons. During this intense search, Ethan had a direct, terrifying confrontation with the true entity behind the haunting, the malevolent consciousness of Silas Blackwood. It was not a traditional ghost, a spectral figure in white, but a pervasive, insidious presence that spoke directly into his mind. The voice was a chilling blend of condescension and delight, a silken whisper that slithered into his thoughts, taunting him with his deepest insecurities and vulnerabilities. "You think you can dismantle my masterpiece?" The voice hissed, its words dripping with amusement. "You? A failed journalist, a man haunted by his own mediocrity? You are merely the latest performer on my stage, and your fear is the most exquisite I have tasted in years." The ringmaster's voice revealed his twisted philosophy, his belief that fear was the purest emotion, the ultimate art form. He explained how he had designed the motel to be a perpetual stage for his psychological experiments, using the fear and despair of his guests to fuel its power, to keep his own consciousness alive and entertained. He spoke of Giggles not as a victim, but as a willing participant in his earlier, less extreme experiments, a performer who had craved the spotlight, even a macabre one. Giggles understood the beauty of sorrow, the voice whispered. His tragic end was not a murder. It was a final, grand performance, a masterpiece of despair that we orchestrated together. This confrontation was not physical, but a battle of wills, a psychological duel where Ethan had to resist the overwhelming urge to succumb to despair and madness. He fought back with the only weapon he had, his journalistic skepticism, his ability to question, to analyze. He challenged the voice, demanding answers, refusing to be a passive victim. But the ringmaster's influence was strong, his whispers insidious, and Ethan could feel his resolve wavering, his sanity fraying at the edges. His search led him to a previously unnoticed door in the motel's basement, a door that was not on any of the building's original blueprints. It was cold to the touch, and a faint, sweet, cloying scent, the scent of decay, emanated from within. He forced it open, and the sight that greeted him was a scene of unimaginable horror. It was a hidden chamber, a macabre gallery of the ringmaster's victims. The skeletal remains of at least a dozen people were arranged in grotesque poses, seated at tables, propped up against walls, as if in the middle of a silent, eternal party. Each skull was fixed with a grotesque, forced grin, their jaws wired into a permanent smile. And surrounding them, perched on shelves, on the floor, even in their laps, were hundreds of clown dolls, their painted smiles a silent, mocking audience to the macabre tableau. The ringmaster's voice echoed in his mind, now laced with triumphant glee. "My audience," it whispered. "They appreciate true art. They will appreciate your performance as well." As Ethan stared in horror at the skeletal grin of a young woman, her bony fingers still clutching a faded photograph of a child, the ringmaster's voice promised him eternal torment if he failed. A final, terrifying image of the ghostly grin filled his vision, now superimposed over the skeletal faces, a chilling premonition of his own potential fate. But amidst the horror, he saw it. In the center of the room, on a raised dais, was a single ornate music box, its lid adorned with a grinning clown. It was the only object in the room that seemed out of place, the only thing that didn't belong to a victim. A cold realization washed over him. It was the core of the motel's power, the heart of the machine. Destroying it might be his only chance at survival, but it was also a monumental risk. What would happen if he unleashed the energy contained within? The chapter culminates with Ethan, his heart pounding, his mind reeling, standing before the music box, the skeletal audience watching him with their empty, grinning sockets, the ringmaster's voice a triumphant roar in his ears, and the ghostly grin a suffocating presence, daring him to make his move. Chapter 6, the grand finale. A desperate gambit. The ornate music box, with its grinning clown lid, pulsed with a faint, malevolent energy. Ethan stood before it, the skeletal audience of the ringmaster's victims watching him with their empty, grinning sockets. The ringmaster's voice, a triumphant roar in his ears, dared him to make his move. This was it. The core of the motel's power, the heart of the machine that fed on fear. Destroying it was his only chance, a desperate gambit in a game where the stakes were his sanity, his life, and perhaps his very soul. He reached out, his hand trembling, and slammed it down on the music box. The lid shattered with a sickening crack, and a cacophony of discordant notes erupted, a twisted, amplified version of the circus music that had plagued him. The room plunged into a chaotic maelstrom of light and shadow. The clown dolls, once static observers, now moved with terrifying speed, their painted smiles contorting into snarls, their glassy eyes glowing with an internal, predatory light. They lunged at him, their tiny, porcelain hands clawing at his clothes, their silent, malevolent laughter echoing in his mind. He kicked and shoved, sending them scattering, but they were relentless, swarming him like a horde of demonic insects. As he fought off the dolls, the motel itself seemed to warp and shift around him. The walls rippled like water, the floor tilted precariously, and the macabre chamber stretched and contracted, creating impossible corridors and dead ends. He was trapped in a grotesque funhouse, a labyrinth designed to disorient and break him. The manifestations became overwhelming and intensely personal, targeting his deepest fears and regrets with relentless precision. Apparitions of his past failures materialized before him. The botched expose, the disappointed faces of his family, the spectral image of his own self-doubt, all mocking him with a ghostly grin. He saw the elderly guest from Chapter 1, her face still contorted in that silent scream, her eyes wide with unblinking terror, now reaching out to him, her skeletal fingers brushing his arm, a chilling reminder of the fate that awaited him. The cacophony of distorted laughter, screams, and circus music reached a fever pitch, a relentless assault on his eardrums that threatened to shatter his sanity. He stumbled, his head swimming, the world spinning around him. He was on the verge of succumbing, of letting the madness consume him, when a flicker of journalistic instinct, a spark of his old resilience, ignited within him. He remembered the ringmaster's journal, the meticulous details of his psychological experiments, his twisted philosophy. The ringmaster fed on fear, on despair. The only way to defeat him was to starve him, to confront his own inner demons, to refuse to be afraid. He focused, pushing through the terror, and began to fight back, not just physically, but psychologically. He screamed back at the apparitions, denouncing his failures, accepting his past, refusing to let them define him. He turned the motel's own psychological weapons against it. He imagined the ringmaster not as an all-powerful entity, but as a pathetic, insecure man, hiding behind his elaborate charade, desperate for an audience. The more he resisted, the more the manifestations seemed to falter, their forms flickering, their taunts losing their sting. Just as he felt a surge of hope, a new, terrifying obstacle emerged. The motel manager, his face contorted into a manic, clown-like grin, his eyes wide and unblinking, lunged at him from the shadows. He was no longer the meek, eccentric figure Ethan had met. He was a puppet, a vessel for the ringmaster's malevolent will. "You won't escape," the manager shrieked, his voice a distorted echo of the ringmaster's. He attacked Ethan with a surprising ferocity, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette on invisible strings. Ethan dodged, parried, and struggled, the fight a brutal, desperate dance in the shifting, warping room. He tried to reason with the manager, to break through the influence, but it was useless. The manager was completely consumed, his only purpose to stop Ethan. In a desperate move, Ethan grabbed a heavy, ornate clown statue from a nearby pedestal and swung it, connecting with the manager's head with a sickening thud. The manager staggered, his eyes briefly clearing, a flicker of recognition, of terror, passing through them. "The key," he whispered, his voice weak, almost human, before his eyes rolled back and he collapsed, dead at Ethan's feet. His final expression was a grotesque, permanent smile, a chilling echo of the clown dolls that surrounded them. The unexpected death, just as he was about to reveal something, left Ethan with a new, unsettling puzzle, a cryptic message in the midst of his desperate fight. The room began to stabilize, the cacophony of sounds fading to a low hum. The ghostly grin, though still present, seemed less vibrant, less menacing. Ethan, bruised and battered, stood panting amidst the shattered remnants of the music box and the motionless clown dolls. He had succeeded, but at a great personal cost. The struggle was not just for his life, but for his mind, and he had emerged victorious, but forever changed. The ghostly grin might fade, but a chilling echo of its presence remained, leading him to wonder about the true extent of his triumph, now stained with blood and a cryptic dying whisper. He had survived the grand finale, but the performance, he knew, was far from over. Chapter 7. The Lingering Echoes. Ethan emerged from the Clown Motel, not into the comforting embrace of normalcy, but into a world that felt subtly, irrevocably altered. The desert air, once a symbol of vast emptiness, now seemed to hum with a residual malevolence. The immediate terror of the ringmaster's psychological assault had subsided, leaving behind a profound, chilling silence, but the experience had carved an indelible mark upon his psyche. He was physically bruised, his body aching from the struggle, but it was the psychological scars that ran deepest, a network of invisible wounds that would never truly heal. He drove away from Tonopah, the garish facade of the Clown Motel shrinking in his rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a distant, unsettling smudge on the horizon. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to put as much distance as possible between himself and that place. The authorities, when he eventually encountered them at a gas station miles down the road, were skeptical, their faces a mixture of concern and thinly veiled disbelief as he recounted a fragmented, sanitized version of his ordeal. He omitted the clown dolls coming to life, the spectral grins, the ringmaster's voice in his head, and the accidental death of the motel manager. He spoke of a break-in, a struggle, and a self-defense incident, a narrative he knew was flimsy, but hoped would suffice. They took his statement, their eyes lingering on his disheveled appearance and the haunted look in his eyes, but ultimately they let him go, perhaps attributing his wild claims to shock or exhaustion. Returning to his own apartment, a place that once felt like a sanctuary was an exercise in disquiet. The motel's influence, he quickly discovered, was not easily shaken. He experienced post-traumatic stress, manifesting as vivid flashbacks that would seize him at random moments, plunging him back into the suffocating darkness of room 13, the cacophony of distorted laughter, and the chilling presence of the ringmaster. Nightmares became a relentless torment, filled with grotesque clown faces, their painted smiles stretching impossibly wide, their glassy eyes fixed on him, always watching. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering, convinced he could still hear the faint whispers of circus music or feel the unsettling presence of clown dolls, even when none were present in his apartment. His journalistic career, which he had hoped to revive with this story, was now a double-edged sword. He had a truly terrifying and unique story, a scoop that could make his career, but how could he tell it without sounding insane? Did he even want to? The credibility of his experience was a constant struggle. He knew that most people would dismiss it as a delusion, the ramblings of a man who had spent too long in a creepy motel. He tried to write, to put his experiences into words, but the horror was too vast, too personal, too unspeakable. The words felt inadequate, hollow, unable to capture the true essence of the terror he had faced. Driven by a desperate need for validation, and perhaps a subconscious desire to confirm that he wasn't entirely alone in his torment. Ethan attempted to contact the elderly guest he had seen fleeing the motel in Chapter 1. He remembered her frantic muttering about the smiles that watch, and a desperate hope flickered within him that she might be a fellow survivor, someone who understood. Through a painstaking search of public records and online databases, he managed to track her down to a small, unassuming house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, hundreds of miles from Tonopah. He drove there, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. He found her, but she was not the fellow survivor he had hoped for. She was catatonic, her face frozen in a grotesque, clown-like grin, her eyes wide and unblinking, mirroring the description of the motel manager's earlier victim. She sat in a rocking chair in her living room, surrounded by dozens of clown dolls, their painted smiles reflecting the eerie rictus on her face. The house was filled with them, perched on shelves, crammed into corners, their glassy eyes seeming to watch him with a silent, malevolent amusement. This encounter shattered any hope of normalcy for Ethan, confirming the pervasive and inescapable nature of the motel's horror. The ringmaster's influence, he realized with a chilling certainty, extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the Clown Motel. It was a virus, a psychological contagion that spread, consuming its victims even after they had escaped its walls. He left the house, the image of the grinning, catatonic woman seared into his mind, a terrifying testament to the motel's enduring power. He understood now that he hadn't truly escaped. A part of the Clown Motel's horror now resided within him, a lingering echo that would forever haunt his waking hours and his tormented dreams. The chapter ends with Ethan attempting to write his story once more, but finding himself utterly unable to articulate the horror, the words dissolving into a meaningless jumble on the page. He looks up from his laptop, his gaze drawn to his own reflection in the darkened screen. For a fleeting moment, he sees it, a subtle, almost imperceptible, clown-like grin forming on his own lips, a chilling premonition that the story was not truly over, and that the ghostly grin might still be watching, waiting for its next performance, perhaps even from within him. Chapter 8. The Final Grin. Months blurred into a disorienting haze for Ethan. The Clown Motel, a place he had desperately tried to erase from his memory, had become an insidious, ever-present shadow. His attempts to write about his experience were futile. The words felt hollow, inadequate, unable to convey the true soul-shattering horror. The ghostly grin, once a fleeting apparition, was now a constant companion, appearing in the reflections of shop windows, in the distorted faces of strangers, even in the patterns of the ceiling tiles. He saw clown dolls everywhere, their painted smiles mocking him from toy store shelves, from children's birthday parties, from the darkest corners of his own mind. The world, once a place of logical order, had become a grotesque carnival, and he, Ethan Hayes, was the unwilling main act, driven by an obsessive, almost feverish need to prove his story, and perhaps to finally destroy the source of his torment. Ethan found himself drawn back to Tonopah. The journey was a pilgrimage into the heart of his own madness. He told himself it was for closure, for answers, but a darker, more insidious compulsion pulled him. A whisper in his mind that promised not just resolution, but a perverse kind of belonging. He found the motel seemingly abandoned, its garish facade faded, its hundreds of clown dolls now coated in a thick layer of desert dust, their smiles less menacing, more melancholic. It was almost normal, too normal. The silence was unnerving, a stark contrast to the cacophony of his memories. He entered the heavy antique key to room 13, which he had inexplicably kept, feeling cold and significant in his hand. The interior was exactly as he remembered, yet subtly different. The air was still heavy, but the oppressive malevolence he had felt before was replaced by a strange, almost welcoming stillness. He walked through the empty lobby, past the silent, dusty clown dolls, their eyes seeming to follow him, not with malice, but with a knowing, expectant gaze. He found the hidden room in the basement, the macabre chamber of skeletal remains. But now, the skeletons were gone. The room was clean, almost pristine, save for a single new clown doll sitting on the dais where the music box had once been. It was a replica of Giggles, its painted smile wide, its eyes gleaming with an unnerving familiarity. He found himself drawn to the front desk, an inexplicable urge to sit behind it. He ran his hand over the smooth, warm wood, a sense of profound familiarity washing over him. He looked at the guest register, its pages filled with names, some familiar from his research, others new. He saw his own name, scrawled in a hand that was unmistakably his, yet somehow alien, on the very last line. He had checked in, but he had never checked out. The cycle of psychological torment, he realized with a chilling clarity, was beginning anew, but this time he was not just a victim. He was a new performer in the ringmaster's unending show. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Ethan became the new manager of the Clown Motel. He cleaned, he organized, he even added a few new clown dolls to the collection, each one chosen with a meticulous, almost reverent care. He found himself humming the distorted circus music, the melodies no longer terrifying, but strangely comforting. The ghostly grin, once a source of terror, was now a familiar friend. A subtle twist of his own lips that he practiced in the mirror, perfecting its unsettling charm. He greeted the rare guests with a polite, almost unnervingly cheerful demeanor, his eyes holding a secret amusement that they couldn't quite decipher. One evening, a lone traveler pulled into the gravel lot, his car kicking up a cloud of dust. He was a young man, perhaps a journalist, with a camera bag slung over his shoulder and a skeptical, yet curious, look in his eyes. Ethan stepped out from behind the counter, a welcoming smile on his face, a smile that stretched a little too wide, a little too long. "Welcome to the Clown Motel," he said, his voice smooth, almost melodic. The young man looked around, a flicker of unease in his eyes as he took in the hundreds of grinning clown dolls. "I'm here to investigate," he said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Ethan chuckled, a low, guttural sound that seemed to echo from the very walls of the motel. "Investigate, you say? Excellent. We always welcome curious minds." As Ethan handed the young man a heavy, antique-looking key, the number 13 etched into its tarnished brass, the young man's eyes widened. "Wait," he said. "I think this belongs to you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden clown nose, covered in what appeared to be dried, dark blood. It was the very same key Ethan had found in Chapter 3, the one he had inexplicably left behind. The young man then smiled, not with fear, but with a knowing, unsettling grin that mirrored Ethan's own, and said, "The performance is just beginning." Ethan's smile widened, stretching his lips into a grotesque, permanent rictus that perfectly mimicked the clown dolls surrounding him. His eyes, once filled with terror, now gleamed with a chilling, knowing amusement. He took the wooden nose, his fingers brushing against the young man's, and felt a familiar burning sensation. The young man was not an innocent victim, but another agent of the motel's influence, perhaps even the ringmaster himself in a new form, or a successor to the cycle. The horror was truly unending and self-perpetuating, with no escape. Ethan, the failed journalist, had not only been consumed by the motel, but had become the very horror he sought to expose, a living embodiment of the ghostly grin. He was now an active participant in its perpetuation, ready to welcome the next curious mind into the unending performance. The final image was of Ethan, standing amidst the grinning clown dolls, his own face now a part of their macabre collection, a permanent, chilling smile etched upon his features, ensuring the performance never truly ends, and that the new guest would be his first victim, a fresh canvas for the ghostly grin.